Before we begin, I would like to introduce my colleague here. I'm very honored to have had the opportunity to work with Professor Christine Goodman. She graduated from Harvard College and went to Stanford Law School. Not a bad background. She taught at UCLA. She's worked in a major law firm in Los Angeles, and she's now on the faculty at Pepperdine Law School since 2001. In addition to teaching evidence and having written a book on California evidence, Professor Goodman teaches a course and seminar on race and anti-discrimination. She is very knowledgeable in this field, and I'm very proud to have her start the program on this topic, recognition and elimination of bias in the legal profession.
Thank you, Mike.
You're welcome.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm excited to be here with you today, and I appreciate you getting up so early on a Saturday. First, I want to just go through an outline of today's presentation. We're going to be talking about, first of all, why we keep talking about elimination of bias. Then I'm going to briefly explain some of the laws and regulations that apply and give you just a little bit of statistics just so we can see where we are in this legal landscape. Then I'll turn it over to Myer, and he'll go through the science of implicit bias, and we'll then discuss some of the effects of implicit bias, and then wrap up with how to manage bias as best we can. Our objectives for today, to explain how in-group and out-group stereotyping influences our thinking. We also want to make sure that you understand the effects of bias in the legal system and in the larger society. And then finally, as I said, we want to have an objective to give you tools for managing the biases that we all have. So first, why do we keep talking about elimination of bias? Laws and regulations already prohibit discrimination. We've got federal and state statutes. We've got rules of professional conduct. But still, there are instances of discrimination. When we look at the statistics over time, they show that the legal profession has made some very important gains in terms of representation of women, in terms of representation of people of color, but there's still a lot of progress that needs to be made. So something is still missing, despite our best or second best or sometimes mediocre efforts in these areas. We see in the media every day people are treated unfairly. In our personal experiences, we see people are treated unfairly. And that's part of why we still need to have this conversation about the elimination of bias. Now, elimination of bias is the category that the State Bar has put forward, but when you listen to the science and you hear more of Myer's part of the presentation, you'll really understand that eliminating bias is too lofty a goal. We have biases, we all do, and we rely upon them in our everyday lives. What we really want to do is reduce bias. We want to reduce the impacts of our bias on our behavior. So that I'd like to say. So talking about the laws, just briefly, we've got Title VII of the Civil Rights Act celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. It prohibits employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. We've got the Equal Pay Act from 1963, protects men and women who perform substantially equal work. So we've got laws that try to make sure that things are equal. We've got the Americans with Disabilities Act, which prohibits employment discrimination against qualified individuals with disabilities in the private sector, in state and local governments. We've got the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, protecting individuals over 40 years old. The Fair Employment and Housing Act in California, also providing protection against discrimination in the employment context. One other law that I just want to briefly mention in California is the Unruh Civil Rights Act. Many of you may be familiar with this act, but basically what it does is prohibit all types of arbitrary discrimination. So not just sex, race, national origin, ancestry, age, disability, but medical conditions are included, personal characteristics, geographic origin, and physical attributes. Some additional protection the Unruh Act provides is for perceived characteristics. So if you think someone goes in a particular category and treat them differently because of that, that's actually prohibited under the Unruh Act if it's one of these prohibited categories, whether or not they are actually in that group. So if you treat someone differently because you say, oh well, I think she's gay. Okay, well if you treat me differently because you think I'm gay, even if I'm not gay, there is a law that will prohibit that. Most recently, on the national level, in July of this year, the President signed an executive order to prohibit discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity in federal contracting. So, as I said, we're making great strides. In addition, we have California Rules of Professional Conduct, which all of you as attorneys are familiar with. This prohibits discrimination by attorneys in hiring, promotion, terms of employment, and firing. And yet we hear stories. I heard a story just a couple of months ago that a study was done in this past year where law firm partners were given a memo. Some of the partners were given a memo that had one associate's name on it. Others were given the exact same memo but with a different name of the associate. Dozens of partners were asked to evaluate the memo, to critique it, and to provide an evaluation of that associate based on the written work. The results were a little astounding because some of the critiques came back as, wow, this associate's fantastic, excellent legal analysis, great work, partnership material. Some of the critiques came back as, I don't even know why this person is working. This is a terrible memo. In fact, I don't even understand their chain of reasoning, their analysis, all those types of things. The only difference in the memo was that on the from line, there was a name that people thought was African American. On the from line of the other memo was a name that people thought was Anglo. Same exact memo sent to dozens of partners around the country, and yet different results. And so that's part of why we still need to think about what makes people evaluate that memo differently when the only difference is their expectation based on the name of who wrote that memo. So now I'm just going to briefly go through some statistics. When you think about the word diversity, we think about differences, we think about minorities, but we also think about numbers and percentages. So I want to just put these slides up quickly so you could see the numbers and percentages for attorneys in 2000 and in 2010. Now, I just got some numbers in California. The California State Bar in 2011 had 2.7% African American attorneys, 2.7%. Latino attorneys, 4.2%. Asian American attorneys, 7.1%, and other minorities, 6.1%. So we still do, as you see, have ways to go. In terms of other numbers, we don't have very good statistics on lesbian and gay attorneys. They're substantially underreported in many of our statutes or in many of our reports. The same with physically challenged and other disabled attorneys. So we don't have a lot of information there. Now, just a couple other slides I want to draw to your attention. Initial employment in private practice. If you look at this slide, what do you see? Almost every group has about 50% of its attorneys starting out in private practice, except for blacks or African Americans. They're at 1/3 starting out in private practice. So when you think about your pipeline, who's making partner, who's becoming managing partners, and all those things, we're already starting from a deficit with African American attorneys in the private practice sector. If you look at minority attorneys by firm size, one thing that you notice is the largest firms have the greatest percentage of diversity. Now, there's not a lot of 700 plus law firms here, so as we go down the scale, we've got 16.59% of diversity in the associate ranks at firms with 100 lawyers or fewer. So there's, again, progress to be made at the smaller levels. The other statistic that I want you to note is almost the majority of attorneys, 48.1%, work either as solo practitioners or in offices of 2 to 10 lawyers. So again, if we're going to try to increase diversity in the ranks, we need to increase the diversity in the solo and small firms. That's really where the most ground can be made. I just want to say, point out a few statistics about gender. Again, women have made great strides in the legal profession back from 1980 when they were 8%. Up to 33%. We have some statistics on female lawyers in leadership ranks in terms of firm partners, managing partners, and associates, as well as general counsel. So again, we're making strides, we're making progress, and we want to make sure that we recognize the progress that's been made, but understand that there's still a ways to go. Initial employment by gender, we see not significant differences between men and women beginning in private practice and government work. The main difference is with the public interest. Almost twice as many women begin their legal careers in public interest situations. So with all of this statistical background, we know we have the laws. One thing that we have to think about is how we appreciate what's missing. Now in this piece, in this slide here, you see, gee, there's a puzzle piece missing and there's a man in a suit with a puzzle piece. So that's the easy case, right? I'm looking for this last piece and now here it is. But say the missing piece is a new attorney, trying to find one that maybe looks like you, dresses like you, has a similar background than you, is what a lot of people attempt to do. What we want to do is recognize that other pieces can fit in the puzzle. Different colors, different genders, different backgrounds, different socioeconomic statuses, different education, and different experiences. So what we want to recognize is to get people to understand that when you haven't experienced a lot of diversity, you may not understand how important it is. But as you work more in diverse groups, as you work with diverse attorneys, as you participate in programs like this, you develop an appreciation of the benefits of diversity. And that's why we are heartened by your participation here. Now, recognize that sometimes the policies and procedures that we have, that we're all moving forward with to try to promote diversity in our workplaces, don't always work out. We've got the Bank of America case, and their gender bias, recent case, 2013, pretty widespread. Similarly, Merrill Lynch, racial bias case, also recent, and millions of dollars to settle. Some of the other things that popped up in the news recently include an article in Science Daily that noted that when men request a flexible work schedule, it's more well received than when women request a flexible work schedule. Thank you, men who are requesting flexible work schedules, but I guess the way it often is perceived is that, wow, he's a dad and he wants to spend more time with his kids. That's great, okay? Whereas mom spending more time with kids is expected and probably not going to always get them on the career track that they would like to have. Another article in Slate last month noted how people reacted to statistics showing that African Americans were either more represented in the criminal justice system or less represented in the criminal justice system. What they did was they showed photos of prison scenes. And when they showed photos that had a larger percentage of Anglos in the photos, people thought maybe we need some prison reform, okay, in terms of a 3 strikes law. When they showed photos that had a larger percentage of African Americans in the photos, people were less likely to say, yeah, we need some prison reform here. So there's still things that are popping up, and there'll be more illustrations that Myer will present. So I'm going to turn it over to Myer.
Thank you. Excellent presentation. Thank you so much. Well, that's so important to have an understanding of the background. I must apologize to start. I started giving this presentation about 5 years ago, and the reason I got into it is because I do mediation. I do no longer practice law after 50 years of practice. It's about time for me to hang up my shingle, and 10 years ago I became a full-time mediator with ADR Services in Los Angeles. And as those of you who do mediation and go to mediation, you know one of the biggest obstacles to getting to resolution is the brain. It's getting, how do we get people who are in conflict to come to say yes? So that drove me to spend my time instead of studying law, I studied psychology, social psychology and social sciences and neuroscience. So I've spent all the last 10 years just going to lectures and going online to lectures, which you can get for free now. I advise you to go see some of the wonderful courses. And so it got me, one particular social science at Arizona State was Robert Cialdini. I don't know if you've heard of him, but I went there and I actually studied with him to learn his principles of influence, the science of influence, which I became a speaker about. The problem with this course is that as I got into the program generally about social psychology and the science of influence, I now got into what is bias, because as people are in mediation, we're filled with biases, and I had to understand that. So I got deeply into it. As I got deeper and deeper into it, I started looking at examples in the newspaper every day. So I started off with about 30 or 40 slides, and now I have about 150 slides. And thanks to my colleague, she was able to cull out many of the slides that said, you know, we don't need all of that in today's program because we have a very short time. But as she culled them out, I put some back in. So, excuse me. And the reason is because I'm so passionate about it. How many of you grew up under segregation in the South? Okay. I grew up in Fort Worth, Texas in 1940s and 50s and 60s. And I can tell you that it was not easy for youngest of 10 from a small immigrant family to live in that environment. It was very difficult growing up. And I saw it from firsthand of seeing the black water fountains and white water fountains. I saw people sitting in the back of the bus whom I knew that I could not go to the back of the bus to sit down with them because we would both be thrown off the bus or be arrested. So it is deep within my soul that discrimination has a very fierce bite. And that's one reason I'm passionate about this, and you'll excuse me for my enthusiasm or emotion about it, because it is part of who we are. It touches everything we do. And it's more than just bias against particular groups of people, but it's bias within our own practice. We are not aware of our bias. And today at the bar, I'm happy to see that there are many programs on bias in employment, bias on the judicial system, and so forth. And you should go to these different lectures because there are many different perspectives. The core of this is about bias is that in our country, we believe in a fundamental rule based on our Constitution that all citizens should be treated equally under the law, and they should have equal protection under the law, regardless of status and regardless of what group they belong to. How many of you would disagree with that? I would hope not one of you. The problem is we don't have that going on in our system today. So we have to talk about why is that so? Why is there the bias? And the basis is that today we do not see express bias, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, but we have implicit bias, which the scientists have discovered in the past 10 or 20 years of how to spot it and how to measure it. So what a recent paper by Matthew Lieberman, who's one of the world-famous neuroscientists, has said, people do not want to believe that they are biased. We are all quick to detect and criticize biased thinking and decision-making in others, but believe that we ourselves are far less susceptible to these same biases, and it is a phenomenon that has been termed the bias blind spot. And there's an entire book by two social scientists who created the concept of blind spot, and I'm going to talk about that later on. So the reality is we all have biases. I'm the first to raise my hand when I tell you I have biases. So please, if you say in a comment that Mr. Sankary is biased, I accept that. And that's the first rule. We have to accept the fact that we have biases. What is bias? So it's a preference or a prejudice for or against an individual. It's a mindset or inclination. It's a bent. It's making a judgment or decisions based on a set of perceptions, beliefs, notions, and stereotypes, usually based on a premature cognitive commitment, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. And it affects behavior of others. So do you have, anybody here have a personal bias? I don't want to ask you to raise your hand right now, but I don't think that there's any of us who, if we search our souls, that we don't have some bias. And bias, by the way, is who we are as human beings. I'm going to explain that in just a moment. If we didn't have bias, we wouldn't be able to make quick, intuitive decisions. But this is an interesting cartoon. I don't know if any of you can see it well, but it says in a personnel who's at the Equal Opportunity Commission says, we can take you on to this woman who's applying for a job, but we'll have to let you go if a man needs your job. Now, it may sound humorous, but I will tell you that in my growing up, I had 4 older sisters, and believe me, they had tough times getting jobs in any kind of professional status other than teaching, nursing, and other fields. By the way, I do want to comment that as I grew up in Texas and I went abroad and came back, I was received well at Texas Christian University, and I have to thank them over and over again for inviting me to come and getting a full scholarship, and I got an excellent education, and I saw bias among the students, but as they interacted with me, those biases began to melt away, and they began to accept me as one of their friends and colleagues. So Texas Christian University was a great university, and I also, because of the great education, I was one of the, I think, affirmative action kids that got accepted into Harvard Law School, because I didn't have the great ability or great SAT scores, but they reached out to get people from all over the country, and so I got a great education at Harvard as well. So on this question of biases to just the issue of who you are, Professor Goodman talked about a test where partners would evaluate papers based on the name on the paper. But did you see a viral YouTube that went out by this young man called Jose Torres? Yeah, and so he said, I couldn't get a job. I applied to hundreds of places, could not get a job. You know what he did? He changed his name to Joe from Jose. And he said he got lots of responses. Do you think that that's bias? Of course it is. We have a natural bias against those that don't sound like us or that come from a different culture. So we have what is known as, excuse me, let me back up here. We have these kind of biases. So you see the little piggy in front of a courtroom full of kangaroos. Now, that may be a cartoon, but in reality, in the South, do you think that there were ever cases where black defendants had to sit in front of an entire white jury, a white judge, and white prosecutors? You bet you did. And also the other one says, the defendant, is he rich or poor? Well, I'll show you cases where that exact thing came up and there were different treatments for those who were rich or poor. So what is bias? And can you be biased even if you believe you are not biased? So I don't know if any of you recognize this gentleman on the left. I think there's not anybody in the state of California who doesn't know who this gentleman is. I think you should listen to the conversation he had with his girlfriend. If you go and listen to that tape, you'll be not shocked, but you probably would say, well, you know, that's his point of view. It's cultural. Well, he lost a very important asset called the Clippers, and he's banned from all NBA games because of what he said in a private conversation. Now, the gentleman on the right, who is that? That's Cliven Bundy. Do you know what he said? The guy who stood there protecting American rights and individual rights and was standing there for the Constitution, he said, blacks were better off under slavery because today they are on handouts from the government. So that's our First Amendment constitutional right guy, Cliven Bundy. Then on the bottom right is a brand new one that just came up. Have you heard of Mr. Levinson and the Atlanta Hawks, who just resigned because of his statements? And I'm going to show you what he said. That he acknowledged to be biased and he could no longer serve as a primary owner of the Hawks. So what's the nature and origin of bias? Well, first of all, it is part of the animal kingdom to have a preference. Even monkeys can be shown to have a preference over one to another thing. And babies, even as small as 2 or 3 months, have shown to have preferences of one doll over another, black or white. They've done testing in Mexico, and they were shocked to see even children who had dark skins would prefer a white doll to a black doll. And so we also have nurture. And those, by the way, those children did not have nurture. They were not influenced by anything other than they were just human beings being born and learning the world. And so here we have nurture. So our views are shaped by what we are told about individuals or our interactions with them. And here we have an Indian. Well, I grew up in Indian country, and it was scary to me because they were presented as the bad guys because there were cowboy and Indian movies. That's what I grew up on, and all the evil guys were Indians, and the good guys were cowboys, white cowboys. And then we have, particularly in the South and Texas, we grew up having real aversions to people who did not look like us, even Hispanics. So the important thing is, what is the root of bias? Well, it's because of our human mind thinks in terms of categories. If we weren't able to think in terms of categories, we would not be able to maneuver and understand the world. And our brain is always seeking to understand the world we live in. So there's the apple. Well, once you eat the apple, it becomes part of you. Is it still the same apple? No, it's you. And then you have a tree, you have a chair, you have a dog, and you have a lion. Now, if you weren't able to distinguish between a category of a dog and a lion, I don't think you would be here. I've been out in the jungle. I've been taking wonderful safaris, and we've come across a pride of lions, and they look very tame, and you'd almost want to pet them. But boy, if you don't know what the consequences are, you would be not able to survive. So, when we talk about categories, that leads people to stereotype. We generalize. That makes sense of the world. And stereotypes lead to biased judgments. So, here's what Mr. Levinson said. My theory is that black crowds scared away the whites, and there are simply not enough affluent black fans to build a significant season ticket base. That's not all he said in a written memo to his other owners. Have any of you seen the memo? Well, you should take a look at it, because I don't think he intended in any way that he was racist or biased. It was a business decision. He was trying to get more people to build up a fan base. But these are filled with content of biased judgments. Then you have this statement, don't bring black boyfriends to the Clipper games. That's so famous now, it's been spread all over the world. And who was he saying that you shouldn't be seen with? And who was he offended by when she had a picture, his girlfriend had a picture with an African-American? Who was that African-American? Magic Johnson, one of the most revered, respected individuals in all of sports and probably all of the United States. So look at his cultural background and how he came to that decision. And then categories and stereotypes end up with statements like this. They are inherently stupid, criminal, lazy, worthy of distrust and fear, dependent on government handouts. These are all quotes that I can show you all throughout the system. And this one is really one that troubles me the most. So it also affects judgments and behaviors, even by judicial officers. And here's a very well-known Fifth Circuit federal appellate justice who was the presiding justice and was considered for the Supreme Court. Now listen what she said at a meeting of the Federalists at the University of Pennsylvania. Blacks and Hispanics are more prone to commit crimes. Among her comments were that racial groups like African Americans and Hispanics are predisposed to crime, are prone to commit acts of violence, more likely than other ethnicities to be involved in heinous acts. And I haven't given you the worst of it up here. What she also said is that the death penalty is really very cleansing and is good for the defendant because it gives the defendant an opportunity to make amends with his God. You don't think that that has some little bit of bias and background in her upbringing? Can you imagine being a black defendant having a case reviewed by this justice? And do you think that there's any repercussions for her having done that? Yes, there was a lawsuit filed, there were complaints filed, but nothing will be done. So, bias and prejudice arises from a very early, uncritical mindset. As we are young, we have formed mindsets as youth without the ability to have critical analysis of what is being said. As a child, we don't really say to our parents, oh, you're wrong. We accept it primarily. So it ends up with what's called a premature cognitive commitment. And it puts us on a pathway of mindless behavior, on automatic pilot. We apply patterns that we acquired early to future events automatically and intuitively. So we end up with statements like all women are alike, or all blacks are, or all Jews are, which I heard often in Texas. All Mormons are, all Muslims are terrorists, right? That's what we heard so often. So this is a result of the in-group and out-group bias. Some of you might be a UCLA fan. Some of you might be USC fans. I'm not going to tell you which one.
And some of us are Stanford fans.
I'm not going to tell you which one I'm in. But this really, if you stop to think about it, that as a member of society, you are always a member of some group, a religious group, a school that you went to. You're a member of the bar. You are all lawyers, right? So you have an in-group. And as a result, you look at other people as the out-group. People who are not lawyers are the out-group. Your clients are the out-group. And sometimes we treat them differently. And what's really interesting is when you go to situations like Ferguson, you see the police who are all in one group, and you see the citizens in another group, and they're treated very differently. And this in-group and out-group, by the way, is historically, you can see the worst example was in the Holocaust, because that's exactly what the Nazis were able to do very efficiently, is to denigrate anybody that they put in the out-group to the point where they were not even considered humans and they could be eliminated from society. Believe me, that was a very part of my young growing up, because I saw people coming into our community with tattoos on their arms, numbers, who escaped the Holocaust. And it's a very difficult thing to accept. But that's what happens when we have in-group and out-group biases. So if we go more to the cognitive aspects and the neuroscience basis of it, it starts with the fact that the human element is that we have what's called the amygdala, or the reptilian part of our brain. Our origins are fear or flight. Our prefrontal cortex, by the way, is a much later development. It's the reasoning part of our brain. And so it's an evolutionary survival mechanism that is automatic. So another element that Matt Lieberman has brought out in a very recent paper just a few months ago in the Neuro Leadership Institute, which I belong to, he wrote that the heart of this is that there is a need to be right. In fact, the feeling of being right is part of a chemical process in the brain that makes you feel good. It's like eating ice cream or having a nice cake or having a wonderful walk in the park. It makes you feel good to be right. On the other hand, you want to avoid being wrong because that creates all kinds of stress and feelings of distress in your body. And so at the heart of this mechanism of being right is that it creates, once you have this belief that this is the way the world is, this is my mindset, nobody should tell you otherwise that you are wrong because it doesn't feel good. So it's very difficult in a mediation, for example, to come up to someone and say, you are wrong. Never, ever use that because people will respond negatively to that kind of comment. You've got to work with them and try to bring their views along with another perspective. Now, one of the great Nobel Prize thinkers who was a scientist in psychology with his colleague Moshe Tversky, Kahneman and Tversky won the Nobel Prize for a new concept called the prospect theory. They studied human behavior and they found out that there were two systems of thinking. And there's a book called Thinking Fast and Slow. If you haven't seen it or read it, take a look at it. It's a bit thick, bit difficult, but please take a look at it because he has a very, this is the, almost all social psychologists today will quote Dan Kahneman's theories. And it is based that we have system one thinking, which is intuitive, instinctive, fast, and automatic. It contains emotions. It's subject to many cognitive biases, and it's arising in our limbic system, the amygdala. Whereas system two is deliberative and slow. It's rational, effortful, conscious, and calculating. So what we do is oftentimes is that if we are given a difficult math problem, we will work through it with our prefrontal cortex. If you're given a difficult problem in law and you have to analyze the statute, you use your prefrontal cortex. But if you are reacting to an individual or to the opposing counsel, you often act intuitively. I've seen lawyers, family lawyers, who engage with other lawyers in the courtroom or in the hallway with their clients and actually almost come to fisticuffs because of the highly emotional, intuitive reaction based on their feelings. And so they're not using the slow, rational thought. But what's interesting about the slow, rational thought is that we enlist it to confirm a lot of our biases. So you have to be careful that you just don't automatically think that because you're reasoning something that you're not just automatically confirming your previous intuitive judgment, which is biased. And that is called confirmation bias. And many lawyers fall into this trap. I think you will agree that we look for, even when confronted with facts or law that oppose our position and may cause us to lose at trial, we negate those facts and we look for other facts in the law that support our position. That's called confirmation bias. So this is very important for lawyers to understand because this can lead you to taking a case to trial that you should never have done so. So, what are snap judgments? Well, this is part of the intuitive, quick thinking process. So when you encounter another person, this study was done by Amy Cuddy from Harvard Psychology Department. It was done all over the world. And she was wondering what is the reaction when we sit in a train station, when we sit in a public place and we see people come by. How do we judge these people? We're always judging. We're trying to make sense of the world outside. And so what are the things that we do? Well, the first thing we do is, what are the person's intentions toward me? And secondly, what is the person's capability of acting on those intentions? And there is a correlation between the intention, which may be warm or cold, is he hostile or is he friendly, and his competence, so that is his ability to carry out that. So when we look at a white person's face, in this case, is he warm and friendly? He doesn't look so, but he's still part of the white culture, so you might give him a break. On the other hand, you have a dark-skinned person, and you might think differently about that person. Or you have the Indian that is definitely alien to your culture, or the Hispanic. And so you might make a snap judgment thinking that these persons are not warm or friendly, but rather cold and might be hostile. So what's the consequences of bias in the legal system? Well, when bias is merely a personal preference, there's little or no consequences. If you like ice cream, you might have a chocolate or you might have a vanilla. It doesn't make any difference. Or if you like a Mercedes or if you like a Tesla, make your choice. But when bias affects the decision or judgment of someone in power, there are serious consequences of this. And here's a good examples. So in the police department in New York, you heard what happened to the gentleman who was selling cigarettes. He was well known to the police. What did they do? They gave him a chokehold. When he cried out to say, "I can't breathe," they didn't care. They choked him to death. So that case is now pending as a criminal case. And then you have Michael Brown's case, which has ignited the country. You've seen those videotapes. You've seen discussions on all the media about this case. And it's created a major issue in this country to make us recognize, did the police officer shoot this person who was innocent of anything? He was holding up his hands, they say, and he continued to shoot at him. And so you see the protest in Ferguson saying, "Don't shoot, I'm black." Now you see an unequal application of the law. Here is a case, how many of you have heard of Marissa Alexander, the woman who, in defending herself, she shot a gun into the ceiling because her husband was going to abuse her, and she wanted to threaten or make him stand off. Well, they prosecuted her, and the judge gave her 20 years and refused to give her, or did not find that she legitimately used the stand and defend yourself. But if you remember Trayvon Martin and Mr. Zimmerman, well, Mr. Zimmerman got off by shooting a young black kid. Is that an equal application of the law? Is that part of our justice system? It's a serious issue. And is it based on racial preferences? Well, those are things that we have to ask about. Now, about the status of being wealthy or not. Have you heard about the affluenza case? In Fort Worth, Texas, there was a young man in his 15, got a truck, driving it while he was 3 times over the drinking limit, and he had about 3 or 4 kids in the back, and he's doing a wild drive, and what does he do? He runs into 4 people standing on the side of the road helping each other with a car, and he kills them. It comes before the judge, and the judge looks at it, and the defense is affluenza. The kid didn't know better. He had too much wealth. He was given too many things. He just didn't understand right from wrong. So what did she do? She gave him probation. Not only probation at a normal probation place, but at a luxury palace here in Malibu. Okay? The father ended up also committing a crime somewhat later. But this is the kind of unfair application, unequal protection that I'm talking about that arises, I think, from bias. What's the effect of judicial bias in these kind of cases? When Woodward v. Alabama, even though the man was convicted of murder, he still got a life sentence from the jury, 8-4 for life. But the judge overrode the jury. Why was that the case? Well, when it got to the Supreme Court, Justice Sotomayor dissented, and she pointed out that since 2000, 27 life-to-death overrides out of 27 in the country, 26 were in Alabama. Does that show you some kind of pattern? Did you know that judges campaign in elections on records of giving death sentences in Alabama? Would you say this is an example of bias? So in this case, the jury overrode the life sentence imposed by a jury, and the judge's reaction when asked about it, he said, well, voter reaction does have some impact, especially in high-profile cases. Let's face it, we're human beings. I'm sure it affects some more than others. So should you put a man to death because of that kind of bias and because you've been paid money? And then you might have heard of this recent case. This is a big one. Have you heard about the McCollum case? So these 2 young men, ages 15 and 19, were convicted of a heinous crime of killing a young girl. It was a terrible, terrible death. And the police went after them because, first of all, they were both mentally deficient. But they didn't care. And if you look at the prosecutor, he was the killer prosecutor in that particular jurisdiction. But now, 30 years later, after spending 30 years on death row and could have been executed, they found DNA. And the DNA proved that they could not possibly have been the killers. Yes, they did confess. Is it possible that you can get wrongful confessions? All over. They're all over the cases all over the United States where wrongful confessions have been obtained, particularly from weak-minded individuals. And what's sad about this is that there's a Supreme Court justice who made a big issue about this and saying the justification for the death penalty is exactly this type of case. These 2 murderers should be given the death penalty. I won't name the justice, but he was here at the convention. They don't believe that innocent people can be convicted. Is that a bias? I think it is. That's the problem, is that bias is so insidious. It's implicit bias. It's bias that we do not understand and we're not aware of. That brings us to conclusions like this. And the problem is the real the offender, the real rapist, went on to commit more murders. And he was only 100 yards away from the murder that had been committed. So there are many effects of bias. You've heard of the Hobby Lobby. You've heard of the children immigrant. You've seen protests against immigrants. The gay marriage and sexual issues are all over the news. Religious bias. You know, I could go on and on. I don't have time. And then there's the jury bias selection. So in theory, juries should be impartial without bias. But how many of you who practice law would prefer a juror that is biased in your favor? And so we do try to select, if we can, based on what we think would be a jury who would favor our position. And then you do have the Wheeler-Batson rules. I'm sure those of you who go into criminal cases know about that. But here's a bias in stereotypes. Studies show that white jurors tend to be biased against black defendants because they do not give a black defendant the same presumption of innocence, but rather the reverse is true. These are studies that have been done in many jury cases. And then there's the shooter bias, in which people have been given a gun in a simulation and asked to see whether someone is holding a gun or holding just a telephone, a cell phone. And over again, the reaction is that more blacks are shot holding innocent objects like a wallet in a famous case that happened in New York. And they're shot just because of the color of their skin. So what's the effect and cost to society? Number one, it undermines trust and confidence in the public, in the legal system. There's a denial of due process and equal protection that I talked about at the beginning. It creates the perception that the system is unfair. It can result in denial of access to jobs, as I talked about with Jose. It can result in convictions of the innocent, and the guilty remain free to commit more crimes. Now, there are all kinds of biases. I won't go into them, but they're cognitive and social and media bias and so forth. I won't go into that. But the important thing here is the Implicit Bias Project. It's called Implicit. You go to a website called implicit.harvard.edu. It's in my papers that I wrote, and that's published in your materials. And it's written by, there's a book called Blind Spot, Hidden Biases of Good People, written by Professors Banaji and Anthony Greenwald. And so the test can be taken, and you can see whether or not you have any kind of implicit bias. That is, biases that you would state before you took the test that you have no bias toward this particular group. And as you take the test and you see the results, you may be offended that the test reveals that you have a bias. So it's important to understand implicit bias, which is largely automatic. It's characteristic in questions such as skin color, age, sexual orientation. It operates so quickly in the relevant test that people have no time to deliberate. It's for this reason that people are often surprised to find out that they show implicit bias. So many good people say in good faith that they are fully committed to anti-discrimination principles with respect to the very trait against which they show a bias. Well, there's the social attitudes we know have changed slowly. As Professor Goodman has shown over time, we've had many laws. But it does bend slowly, and the only way we're going to make progress is for lawyers such as yourself to understand wherein lies implicit bias, that is, biases that we don't recognize, biases that we don't recognize in our clients, and biases that recognize in society, which we have the ability to change. So here are 7 suggestions for managing or mitigating bias. I don't believe we should eliminate it because it's part of our human nature, as I said. We have to accept that all of us have implicit bias. That's the very first step. And when making a judgment or decision, we must be aware of the social consequences of bias and prejudice. We should judge others based on individual merits, as Martin Luther King said, and not on preconceived stereotypes of the color of their skin or their beliefs or who they are. We should use the system to rational, effort process to understand how we can deal with bias. We should speak out against bias when you hear it, encourage diversity, follow the rules of anti-discrimination and the professional code of ethics, and attend training programs. And finally, in managing bias, We should have empathy toward others, and we should be motivated, concerned for others with humility. We should be somewhat humble in knowing that we can make mistakes unknowingly and we want to correct them. See the world from other perspectives and travel. When forming beliefs and making judgments, be aware of your hidden biases and try to modify your behavior by using expressions that are showing understanding of the bias that you might have. Show empathy, tolerance, and compassion, and volunteer for projects that are pro bono. And now I turn it back over to Professor Goodman. Thank you.
Thank you, Myer. All right, so I'm just going to spend just a couple of minutes, because I do want to leave some time for your questions, talking about some concrete strategies for managing bias. The first thing is identify settings for bias. Think about what transparent privileges operate in your workplace, in your life, and those are going to be situations where biases are more likely to come out. Think about whether there are barriers that affect diverse attorneys in your workplace. Are there unspoken rules that some have learned and some have not that are going to keep people down? Another thing is to think about focusing on inclusion. How do you model inclusive behavior? Many firms and organizations will have affinity groups. Small firms and solo practitioners need to affiliate with bar associations and others similarly situated so that you can reach out and get to know people who are from diverse backgrounds or backgrounds just different from yours. Another thing to focus on inclusion is, it seems very simple, but when I ask people this question, I'm very often surprised with the response. Do you know the names of all the people, that you encounter in your daily lives? Just knowing the name of the associate, knowing the name of the African American who serves you coffee or whatever really can go a long way in making a difference. We say hello to our neighbors, we say hello to the people who look like us that we meet in the hallway, but do you stop and say hello to the person who's standing by the sidewalk? Perhaps they're asking for a handout, perhaps they're not, but they're not dressed like you, they don't look like you. If you focus on your own individual behaviors and trying to be more inclusive and tolerant in your behaviors, that will go a long way. And then finally, I want to just talk about how you address discord. There will be times when you might say something not meaning to be offensive, and yet it is, right? One of the things that you want to think about is recall what you said. As Myer indicated, no one wants to be wrong, right? But sometimes we recognize that we are wrong. So be open to feedback. Reflect on what you said, take responsibility, and apologize. An apology can go a long way. I didn't mean to offend you by that comment, Myer. Will you forgive me?
Yes.
That makes a huge difference, right? Instead of me giving him, the stink eye every time I walk by his office and refusing to sit down at a table with him and never having a conversation from that point forward. No, let's just fess up. I'm sorry, and then we move on. A lot of times that really can make a difference. Now, if you were the victim, if someone has offended you by their words or by their conduct, if you can do it calmly and safely, call them out on it. Call them out on it, all right? You don't need to do it in a crowd. You pull them aside and say, you know what, Myer, what you said was so offensive to me, and here's why. And Myer may be receptive, he may not, but hopefully he's listened to what I just said, and he's going to offer an apology, accept responsibility. Now, maybe he doesn't know what he said, or maybe he doesn't think what he said was offensive. That doesn't matter, okay? If he doesn't think what he said is offensive, but I do, then guess what? I am offended. You need to apologize. You may not say, I won't ever say that again, because if you don't think it's offensive, you might not want to, but now you're on notice. Now you understand that, Myer, when you say that to me, I'm going to be offended. If that's how you want to continue our relationship, then that's how our relationship will continue, or not. All right? And then finally, assume goodwill. This is really an important point because nobody wants to be called a racist, and most of us are not racist. But we have implicit biases, and we act on those biases. Some of us have explicit biases, which we recognize, but if you assume goodwill, especially in the professional context, assume he did not mean to offend me. If I come from that place, Myer did not mean to offend me. What would I want someone to do if I offended them and that I did not mean to? I'd want them to let me know. Gently, calmly, but let me know so I don't do it again. All right, so if you put yourself in that place of assuming goodwill, much, much more will be accomplished. So I just want to, in closing, say we got to pay attention to diversity if we really hope to have any more substantial, significant diversity in our leadership ranks of business, politics, and law. Our collective self-interest can only be served with a diverse group of people. We all know that with more diverse people, diverse groups do better. They think more creatively, they think outside the box, they accomplish more in a lot of ways. So developing the skills for professional and personal success include developing the skills to work effectively in diverse communities. These skills are going to increase empathy and understanding. They're going to increase your tolerance of difference and maybe bring you to the level of celebrating difference, which would be great. And eventually maybe we might achieve the State Bar's lofty goal of elimination of bias in the legal profession. Thank you.